First, I would like to thank all of you who are here and the ones on Zoom. I would especially like to thank Anja, Martin, and the Auerbach Institute for giving me the opportunity to present our research. I would also like to thank Frederick for agreeing to work with me on this joint project. He helped me a lot since then. Well, the idea of research started when my host and I were thinking about how to use a praxeological approach to explain or study the social and economic changes of the indigenous people during the Spanish colonial regime in Peru. We consider it important to question the idea of knowledge and the modernization process as a consequence of government action without paying attention to the agency of the social groups. Then we developed some preliminary questions with a praxeological approach. How did the Spanish implement new economic and social practices? And what exactly were they? Did the indigenous population maintain, change, replace, or hybridize their own practices? Which problems did occur by implementing new practices? The purpose of this project is to analyze such practices of indigenous communities in Peru during the 18th century. In particular, the use of mules and iron tools. It is evident that their practices were influenced by a colonial context, characterized by a society structured around the state and an equal legal system, the exploitation of resources, and a derogatory view of the physical and intellectual capacities of indigenous populations. In the 18th century, a new process of Hispanicization of indigenous lifestyle began, with the aim of improving productivity. We understand Hispanicization as a Eurocentric process of modernization of structures, elements, practices, and customs according to European parameters in a historical context. The objective was predicated on the colonial belief that the indigenous peoples were lacking rational economic practices and failed to contribute to the economic growth of the Spanish monarchy. However, there was room for indigenous agency in maintaining and transforming ways of life according to their interest. In recent years, several studies have challenged the notion of a forced Hispanicization of the American populations by the Spanish Empire. The practices of indigenous people, such as the creation of interethnic networks and the use of the legal instruments of the Spanish system, show not only knowledge of the colonial structures, but also an active participation in the Hispanicization process. Within the context of Spanish domination, indigenous populations demonstrated a capacity for social mobility, attaining prominence in political, military, and ecclesiastical spheres. Using praxeological perspectives, we intend to focus on indigenous agency in interaction with the ongoing process of Hispanicization and modernization. In this sense, indigenous peoples were not merely targets, but also active participants in their own Hispanicization. For example, the purchase of mules and the utilization of iron in agriculture were both a response to government directives and a manifestation of the indigenous pursuit of well-being. For a significant proportion of the indigenous population, the process of becoming Spaniards was a deliberate strategy for achieving social advancement and economic growth. The proposed research project aims to ascertain the extent to which the indigenous people rejected or contributed to their modernization of their work. Here is an illustration from the famous Huaman Poma Chronicle. We can see a native lord right here, native lord who adopted Spanish clothing, while the indigenous commoner is dressed as they were before the conquest. Over time, however, it became more frequent for commoners to dress like Spaniards. I will explain the context later. In this lecture, I will address three aspects of the project: the historical context of the Peruvian viceroyalty in the 18th century and the situation of indigenous communities, the commercial and agricultural practices based on the use of iron and mules and by indigenous people, and finally, the advantages and challenges of a praxeological perspective in historical research. Here you can see a map of the viceroyalty of Peru in the 18th century. The map has been rotated 90 degrees to the left, and for example, the Pacific Ocean is now in the southern part of the map. The maximum authority of Peru was the viceroy in political, economy, and military aspects. Anyway, he was a public servant of the Spanish crown, and the most important orders and reforms were driven from Spain. You can also see different colors in the map. Each of these regions were called intendencias and were managed by an intendente. So we have the Intendencia of Trujillo, Intendencia of Lima, Arequipa, and so on, plus the Intendencia of Puno, according to this map, will be on the north, that was incorporated later. Each of these regions were subdivided into partidos, provinces, or subdelegaciones, and were managed by a subdelegado. So in total, we have one viceroy, 8 intendentes or regional authorities, and 54 subdelegados or local authorities. It is also important to mention that the system was the result of a political and territory reorganization in 1784 in the context of the Bourbon reforms that I will explain later. Prior to these years, intendentes and subdelegados didn't exist, and instead of them, provinces were managed by corregidores, an authority somehow in between an intendente and a subdelegado. Throughout this presentation, I will refer to these local authorities in relation to the indigenous population. Colonial Peru was a stratified society, and all the indigenous people fell under a special category known as Indios. Following the conquest, the Spanish crown acknowledged indigenous peoples as rational beings and free vassals, unlike African slaves. However, they were considered as minors and ignorant people that could not survive without Spanish protection. According to this way of thinking, the indigenous population had to be evangelized and civilized. This task fell to parish priests, Spanish authorities like the corregidores, and encomenderos, the first generation of colonizers, as we can see in the slide. While the crown recognized the titles and privileges of native lords, most of the indigenous were grouped under a legal and physical category different from that of the Spaniards, or the Spanish colonizers. Among their obligation was the tribute, a community tax in recognition of their vassalage to the King of Spain. They also had to perform the mita, a rotating system of labor in exchange for a low wage that helped them pay the tribute and benefited productive centers such as plantations, mines, and textile workshops. However, they were granted certain privileges, such as exemption from sales tax, exception from tithing to the Catholic Church, and privileged legal assistance from the protectores, the Indios. Here you can see a picture of the royal family of the House of Bourbon, originally from France, but has also ruled Spain since the beginning of the 18th century after the House of Habsburg. The advent of the Bourbons marked the start of a new process of knowledge renewal and modernization of economic structures in Spain and its colonies, historiographically known as Bourbon reforms. This period was notable for the development of many projects, the creation of educational institutions, laboratories, and scientific expeditions to Spanish America, such as the travels by Alexander von Humboldt or by Jorge Juan and Antonio de Ulloa. Certainly, many of these endeavors in the Spanish colonies were directed towards the exploitation of resources and the increase of the royal treasury. Therefore, economic activities such as agriculture, trade, and mining were promoted. The development of these activities was supported by technological reforms that improved productivity. The most significant technological development in the Spanish American economy was directed toward mining, given the substantial value of silver. The invention of a modern silver refining machine by the mineralogist Ignaz von Born spread quickly through the mines of Central Europe in the 1780s. This innovation comprised 10 boilers driven by a water turbine, which heated the pulverized ore along with quicksilver to achieve the amalgamation process of silver. The Spanish government assembled a group of specialists, mostly from German cities, and dispatched them to Spanish America to implement this new technique. It was faster and consumed less quicksilver. This was very important given the scarcity of quicksilver in the mine of Almaden in Spain and Huancavelica in Peru, the main suppliers of the Spanish-American silver mines. In addition to this technological knowledge, some scholars highlighted the importance of practical knowledge by the indigenous mine workers. Here is the new method implemented in the Peruvian mines. This is a drawing from the famous codex edited by Martínez Compañón, a bishop of Trujillo in the 18th century. And this codex contains many interesting illustrations. We will see some of them in the following slides. However, the Bourbon reforms, which sought to consolidate control over their territories, perpetuated the colonial discourse that promoted cultural disparities between Europeans and indigenous populations of the Americas. Consequently, indigenous or mestizos, as the Spaniards call the offspring from indigenous and Spaniards, who exhibited a high degree of Hispanicization, capacity, and loyalty to the crown, were granted positions and titles. Still, these individuals ascended through their own efforts and strategies. Furthermore, the indigenous population innovated their agricultural techniques by incorporating iron, plows, and mules to facilitate trade. It is important to emphasize the absence of both instruments and mules in America prior to European settlement. This means that both were introduced to America by the Spaniards. In this drawing, you can see an indigenous man using an instrument, or here, an instrument called the chaquitaglia to dig holes in the ground, and a woman spreading seeds. In this one, an iron plow pulled by two oxes and directed by an indigenous man. The oxes, like the mules, also came to America by the Spaniards. The picture on the left shows an agricultural practice in pre-colonial times, while the picture on the right shows a practice in colonial times. Both were performed by indigenous people, but the one in the right incorporated a European method. In productivity terms, the iron plows led farmers to agricultural tasks faster and with less effort. Morleón and Bourlieu have published studies on the Peruvian and Bolivian Andes at the end of the 20th century that compare these two instruments. They estimated that a farming couple takes 3 to 5 days to plow 1 hectare of land using an ox-drawn plow, compared to 1 month using chaquitaglias. However, the plow is difficult to use in the highlands of the Andes. Regarding the mules, they were the most efficient form of land transport in Spanish America, capable of enduring long journeys and heavy loads. Mules were used to ride, trade, transport minerals, or deliver mail. Even though llamas, we can see over here, and other American camelids that bred in Andean region could be used as pack animals, they could carry less weight than mules. If we compare these two animals, the carrying capacity of a mule is 2 to 3 times more than a llama. For example, one of the biggest differences is that we can ride a mule, but we cannot ride a llama. The Bourbon reform intended to boost the economy of the colonies to encourage production and trade and to increase the industriousness of the indigenous population. This was the aim of the reparto system created by the Crown in 1752. The reparto system was a credit sale of goods to the indigenous communities, including mules and iron. The corregidores were responsible for the distribution of goods, and the caciques or native lords had to pay for them over 5 years. Unfortunately, aiming to increase their profits, many corregidores distributed goods at a higher price and forced the indigenous communities to pay for them. After 1780, the reparto system was eliminated. Some scholars argue that the indigenous people of Peru didn't need mules due to their proficiency in camelid husbandry. However, this assumption detracts from their adaptive capacity and agency. However, this the study of Rachel O'Toole on indigenous muleteers in northern Peru shows that they were not victims of the colonial market. On the contrary, the indigenous people became agents of commercial exchange and managed to rise in social status without disrupting the structures of their community. A lot has been said about indigenous people who worked as muleteers. Even in early times, Bernal Diaz, conqueror of Mexico, wrote that indigenous people from Chiapas used horses and mules to transport firewood, maize, and lime. The traveler Alonso Carrió de la Bandera described the 18th century practices used by indigenous muleteers to tame their mules. He noted that the muleteers from the mountains left their mules tied to a stick for 24 hours to make them docile. However, this practice made mules less robust. In contrast, coastal muleteers strengthened their mules by feeding them alfalfa and maize. Many other indigenous people who were not muleteers also used mules for travel, for travel or daily work, as we can see in the picture. Here we see an indigenous woman from Moyobamba that is located in the Amazon region, and a mule carrying bananas. Certainly, the use of mules did not mean a replacement for camelids. The decision to use mules was ultimately determined by a variety of factors, including purchasing power, terrain characteristics, and climate. For instance, in the challenging terrain of the Andean mountain range, the use of mules faced significant opposition. This is evidenced by the large number of mules that died in the trips from Tucumán to Peru. Tucumán is located in the north of Argentina, so the mules needed to cross the Andes to reach to the Peruvian regions. Also important is the high cost of mules in certain regions and the minimum wage of many indigenous people. Here, for example, we can see a caravan of llamas and not mules carrying quicksilver to Potosí in the 17th century. We are now coming to our third part. One of the most renowned scholars in the theory of practice is Theodor Chasky. He defines practices as embodied, materially mediated arrays of human activity centrally organized around shared practical understandings. But is it possible to reconstruct the transformation of indigenous practices through archival documents? How can this research apply a praxeology method? Similar questions, in a general sense, have been addressed by historians regarding praxeology. In the last years, German historians have been discussing the advantages and challenges of applying practice theory in historical research. One of them, Anne Brendeke, author of the book Praktiken der frühen Neuzeit, has pointed out that praxeological perspectives allow us to explore the patterns and determining factors of everyday life and the lives of individuals in a comparatively open manner, considering discursive, material, cultural, and physical factors, placing them in relation to one another without hierarchy and examining them for interactions. In my opinion, Brendeke accurately describes the profile of the historian in comparison with other humanities scholars, such as anthropologists or philosophers. He mentions, we, the historians, are more interested in the pragmatic use of method. We are classified much less according to our affiliation with a particular school of thought, and we are valued more for our heuristic abilities to exploit and critique sources, for the potential we offer for new and relevant knowledge about the past. If historians care more about what happened than following a specific theory, to what extent will increasing the theoretical basis, in this case praxeology, help us to answer our research questions? Praxeology encourages historians to rethink the role of subjects. But is it not something that we already know? Is there today any historian that could not think beyond structuralism? To apply a praxeological perspective, one of the biggest challenges is the problem of sources. Marian Fussell has pointed out that historians are faced with a situation of specific sources determined by the possibility and chance of transmission. As historians, we have at our disposal the information that writers and artists from a particular historical context choose to record. Although we can trace practices in most documents, these practices are recorded incompletely because most of the time they are not the focus of the text. Here we have a document from the Archivo General de la Nación in Lima, Peru. In 1788, the alcalde de indios from the town of Nepeña requested some mules for the indigenous people and lamented, as the text explained, and I quote, "The misery of 16 years without anyone to sell us even one mule on credit. During this time, the mules that were previously distributed to us by the corregidores have been used up and consumed by the postal service. Having lost all hope, we have no fallback. We cannot seek sustenance for our children." This means that, at least for them, mules were important for their livelihood. Although there is no information about the reasons why the indigenous people of Nepeña needed them or why they could not replace the mules by other animals like camelids. In another example, from 1782, Pedro Villafuerte, a supplier for the Royal Tobacco branch, was accused of stealing 14 mules belonging to indigenous people who were transporting them from the villages of Lucanamarca and Saxamarca. This shows the mule as a valuable property, but it didn't mention how and why they possessed them. We don't know exactly why they decided to use or own a mule or a llama, or under which circumstances. Unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be any documentary record in which an indigenous person explains the advantages of using a mule over a camelid. Of course, these advantages can be deducted, but these writings would have been very helpful for reconstructing the concrete practices. In the best scenario, we can find descriptions of practices, although they are biased. Achim Landbe has asserted that historians can only study the descriptions, not the practices themselves. Therefore, it is necessary to compare or contrast sources to obtain a more accurately picture of reality. For example, in 1786, during the trial of Manuel Rivera, a resident of Camiña, for distributing 200 mules to the indigenous population of Tarapacá, the indigenous said they had taken the mules voluntarily because they needed them, and not by force. In contrast, the trial against the subdelegado of Abancay in Cusco stated that the indigenous people didn't need mules. In 1808, Rafael Ramírez de Arellano, protector de indios, accused the subdelegado Domingo Pagaza Ortundoa of distributing or repartir mules and iron to the indigenous community of Huarocondo. Ramirez de Arellano pointed out that they received many mules for the exorbitant price of 35 pesos, even though the animals were neither useful nor necessary for their occupation, work, or farming. Likewise, an indigenous villager from Huaracondo said that they didn't need mules or iron because the people of that village were farmers, unlike the mestizos and Spaniards. Another villager said that they used small beasts instead of mules to carry their loads, probably llamas. However, others pointed out that iron was useful for their farms and that they used mules to transport maize to Cusco. I find this example very interesting because people from the same village have different opinion about economic practices. Also, in some cases, the indigenous population wanted to obtain mules, but they refused because they were weak, sick, or too expensive. In 1788, Santos Anaya, an indigenous villager of Mara, said that his subdelegado forced him to buy an untamed but an useless mule for 24 pesos. He said that he didn't pay because repartos were illegal. This could be the case for most of the indigenous complaints about repartos of mules, but the documents don't provide further details. Another aspect of the praxeological approach that we consider particularly important and which is relevant to our research is its critique of certain structural and discursive concepts. As praxeology emerged in opposition to structuralism, it challenges ideas of societies that are determined only by systems and institutions. Instead, it places greater emphasis on the social interactions of the individuals who comprise them. A very well-known example is the study of capitalism. Which is the origin of capitalism? Did it emerge as an economic system that replaced feudalism? Or do we need to focus on the role of merchants and understand capitalism as an interrelationship of human practices? This way of thinking also applies to administrative practices. In Hannah Soncayalvi's work on early modern Vizcaya, we see cases in which regulations, so the structural level, did not create administrative practices. Rather, these practices force the regulations to be transformed. Administrative practices are not only determined by the rules established for civil servants, but also by the motivations of those involved. This grants a high degree of autonomy. According to Nicolaus Buschmann, historical perspectives produce modernization. Rather than considering modernization as the change that precedes social perception, the praxeological approach considers modernization as a product of this change. In our research, we see how colonial official documents create the impression that indigenous communities remained unaltered in their internal structure over time. This idea was more influenced by discourses, preconceived notions, and imagined characteristics than by empirical analysis. denying the ability of indigenous men and women to implement new elements and improve their productivity, perpetuates the colonial discourse that portrays them as helpless and incapable. It is important for scholars to contrast official information with the information we can extract and interpret from documents. The praxeology perspective focuses on human and non-human interactions. Chatsky mentions that most practice theories will agree that activity is embodied and that nexuses of practices are mediated by material and human agency like the human-computer interface. Also, animals can be understood as non-human factors that contribute to human activity. In our research, we can see how iron tools and mules influence trade and agricultural practices. At this stage, we are only able to offer a preliminary conclusion. We have documented a large area of the Peruvian viceroyalty. The documents show how the indigenous population used mules and iron tools in different geographical locations, including the coast, the mountains, the north, the center, and the south of Peru. Indigenous muleteers travel between towns and regions, and indigenous farmers use these tools to carry loads and plant crops more easily. However, it is still difficult to estimate the percentage of indigenous people who adopted this new method. What we can be sure of is that indigenous men and women modernized their practices when it was convenient for them, regardless of the government's efforts. They did so when they had the necessary capital or when land or climate was favorable. We hope that these postulates will be useful to you and that your contributions will help us continue our research. Thank you for your attention.